Welcome to the podcast on non-interpretive skills in radiology. Our topic today is HIPAA and IRB. I'm joined by Elizabeth Kopinski, who works with me. Elizabeth, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Elizabeth Krupinski here. I am the Vice Chair for Research in Radiology, and glad to be here, Nadja.
Thank you so much. HIPAA and IRB are very closely connected. That's why we're talking about this together. Maybe let's talk a little bit about HIPAA first. This is the Health Insurance and Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. What can you tell us about HIPAA?
HIPAA is really there to protect patient privacy. There's a long history of it, and it actually came out years ago, 1996, as you mentioned, in response to abuses actually by the pharmacy industry, where they were being
Mm.
sold lists about patients' information. The federal government was looking at this and saying, this is wrong. You can't just give away patient information in order to sell products, basically, sell drugs in this case. So they initiated all of this, and it was developed primarily within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Civil Rights. You can actually be penalized monetarily for release of personal health information without the patient's knowledge. Like I said, there's a long history to it, and the basic goals are to protect protected health information. And that encompasses a whole lot of things. There's about 18 different elements that you could find in a medical record that could actually be considered PHI. The obvious ones, which are the names of the patient, their social security number, their medical record number. But there's other things, for example, geographic subdivisions following your zip code, basically. If you follow a zip code and there's less than 10,000 people or 5,000 people that live in a town, you could readily figure out who it is just by looking at somebody's zip code. There's about 18 different unique identifiers that have been listed by HIPAA that you really have to watch out for and be sure you don't disclose.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the one that I was surprised about was license plates, because I know sometimes people have funny license plates. And when you take a picture of that in front of the hospital, you can't really publish it like on social media. Have to be wary of that. And also biometric identifiers, finger and voice prints, and full face photographs, which we often use in medical publications when we're showing a pathology, not necessarily in imaging, but it has come up whether it's allowable in radiology to do a 3D rendering of a patient's face, but it doesn't show the hair. So I don't know what the answer is. Is that allowable or not? Do you know?
You could create it. I'm not sure
Mhm.
you can actually save it or do anything with it. And you're actually getting into a funny area when you talk about these biometrics and fingerprints and voice prints and so on. With all this AI technology, for example, you've got ambient listening technology now that a lot of primary care providers are using. And now technically is just transcribing it. But even then, is that going to go down a rabbit hole where that could be considered PHI if they're transcribing and if they do it word for word and perhaps pick up on a certain pattern of speech, for example, you could potentially
Mm.
identify
Hmm.
somebody. And I
Yeah,
think it's something
interesting.
that is evolving. But yeah, some of the things that you never even thought of, like I said, license plates, that's crazy. Or the VIN, actually, the VIN on your car could be used to identify. Now, why on earth you would put that into a health record? I don't know.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, the biometric identifiers, finger and voice prints, that was actually updated, I think. I'm not sure that one was actually there in the first place. Increasingly, yeah, that's being used.
That's very interesting. There are some exceptions where we can disclose this information. I think if it's part of the care delivery, so if we have exchange information with another provider that we're
Hmm.
handing the patient off to for payment activities, some of this may be disclosed. And then anything where it's related to safety and quality activities, it could be part of compliance and abuse detection where
Yeah.
we need to disclose it. And then there's also some circumstances where it's required by law to release the information to public health authorities, or when there's an investigation of abuse or neglect or domestic violence, something like that. Administrative proceedings and judicial proceedings may require this, law enforcement purposes, workers' compensation, those things are exceptions. All
Right.
right. This plays a role in the IRB as well, the way that we govern the human subjects research. Can you tell me a little bit about the background why we have IRBs in place?
Yeah, and it goes. farther back than a lot of us would actually think or want to think. A lot of it came after World War II. And when it was discovered what a lot of the things were going on, the abuses during World War II in Nazi Germany, when they were doing all sorts of experimentation on humans, obviously without any permission whatsoever on their part. It even goes farther back than that. Basically, at that point in time after the war, they developed the Nuremberg Code, which was really the first international agreement that said, we've got to watch out for this. Research is important, but it has to be conducted in an ethical manner when you're using human subjects. There's a whole separate area of IACUC and animal subjects, which came later, but that's important as well. But with human subjects, it all started, like I said, with the Nuremberg Code, which everybody in the world really came around and said, look, can't just experiment on people. So they developed this code, and it has a set of principles that really said, look, if you're going to involve human subjects in experiments, there's boundaries. One, they have to freely choose to participate. And if you're going to do this, you have to have a clear scientific rationale. You can't just say, what would happen if I did X? And unfortunately, that's what a lot of things were going on in Nazi Germany. There really wasn't a clear scientific rationale. And out of that came the Declaration of Helsinki. And that pretty much took it to a higher level. And that's what most human subjects committees rely on. And countries that don't have human subjects committees actually just refer to the Declaration of Helsinki. So sometimes when you're looking at research papers from foreign countries, they will mention the Declaration of Helsinki rather than the fact that they went through a strict human subjects committee. The Declaration of Helsinki sets out the clear foundation, like I said, that a lot of the institutional review boards, or IRBs, here in the United States use, and a lot of other countries do as well. There was also a lot of other kind of instances aside from the things that were going on in Nazi Germany, but we can talk about those later, some other examples.
Okay. Why don't we talk about it now?
All right. There were a lot of studies actually here in the United States as well. There's studies that were being done in the prison system, for example, on prisoners without their knowledge. And they were involved in studies and being injected with different types of drugs, or there's the famous syphilis trial with Black men. And there were other underrepresented minorities were simply put into these trials and, like I said, injected with drugs or diseases and so on, simply to see what would happen. The scientific rationale was there, but freely choosing to be in the studies was not. And there were a lot of obviously consequences from people being injected with these drugs and diseases. People died, people got sick, and they really had no idea why. The military was also doing a lot of studies without the knowledge or consent of participants. So it's not to say that, oh no, it could never happen here in the United States. It did. You can trace this back to the 30s and 40s. And even after that, a lot of studies were going on up and through it into the 60s. I remember when I started in science and research, IRB was less strict or less formal than it is now. So it actually has evolved over the years. I started working in science in about 1979. And it was still in some of the nascent stages, and we were still finding out about some of these studies that had been done here in the United States against people's knowledge or will.
Yeah. I think the one that you're referring to was the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in
Yep.
Negro males was the title of it. And that went on from 1932 to 1972 for a long time
Yeah.
before it was leaked to the press and then shut down. Yeah, it was really awful. There's definitely a real place for the IRB. When you just have ethical rules and statements in place, that doesn't mean that people really follow it. To have an institution that keep anybody honest is really important. What is the relationship between the IRB and the FDA?
The FDA, obviously everybody knows, Food and Drug Administration, and they have various regulations regarding the approval of devices and so on. Basically, some level, the university or the health system, whatever, has the authority to monitor research. The FDA has regulations as well. And according to them, the IRB at an institution provides them with the authority to approve and modify the protocols or to deny the proposal. So in a sense, a lot of what goes on in an IRB is regulated by different agencies. But the FDA is one that they have rules of their own and regulations, and the IRB has to follow those as well. To say that the FDA is the authority over the IRB is a little strong, but IRBs are required to adhere to what the FDA requires. A lot of that kind of came out of the fact that, if you remember, the FDA, the whole point of them is to approve drugs, devices, but they had to make sure that the studies being done in order to get that approval were actually being done in a proper way. One would like to think that, okay, if it's being done in a hospital and it's being done with patients, of course they're following the rules and regulations, but not always, especially when you've got industry involved. Which, if we go back to what we were talking about HIPAA, that's how we got HIPAA, was because industry started to get involved into research and trying to get patient information and trying to sell drugs. In order to sell the drugs, you've got to develop the drugs. So it's like this very incestuous kind of interbred system there. And we've put these boundaries around, and it's HHS, it's FDA, and they are the ones that are overseeing what goes on. The NIH, when you submit grants, there's a statement about IRB, IACUC in there. So different agencies are in this mix, but the FDA is the one that's most important because they're the ones that kind of help codify some of these rules and have oversight.
I'm curious to know who's on the IRB board. Is there an effort to be diverse, or there's something about considering community attitudes?
Now, most universities or healthcare systems will have an IRB. There's typically a dedicated office for the IRB, and there's typically someone who is a director of the IRB, and they have special training in IRB, in ethics, and quite often they're a PhD or an MD who have shifted into this regulatory space. They just found it fascinating. They don't always need an MD or PhD. You don't have to have that type of degree. But they are people who have gone through all sorts of training to understand IRB and ethics and so on, and they keep up on it. They will often have an office, and then typically they will recruit members of IRB committees from the faculty and staff at whatever the institution is. And what they try to do is, as you said, try to get a diverse membership. That includes MDs as well as PhDs, because a lot of times it's the PhDs doing the research, but it's the MDs that are filtering the subjects their way and so on. The goal is to get the diversity of its race, its gender, its cultural backgrounds, sensitivity for, issues, and as you mentioned, community attitude. What that it refers to is, if the study was made known to the public, would they react and say, oh my God, what are they doing there? What kind of study is this? Why are they only using women in this study? Or why are they only using Hispanics in this study? And you've got to have sort of someone who understands that outside perspective. It's like the conflict of interest committee. When you're on a conflict of interest committee, the key thing that we talk about is there the perception of a conflict of interest. There may not be a conflict, but is there a perception of, could someone look at this and say, I think they're conflicted. They're being paid by the company and they're doing the research too. Something's going on there. It's the same thing with research in general with an IRB committee. You want to make sure that there is no perception of someone out there in communities having the opportunity to look at what you're doing and totally coming away with an impression that says, wow, they're abusing these people. Or, gee, why are they only picking on this group? And so that's what the community awareness part is. And there's some IRB committees that will actually bring in people from the community to be on their committees. And it's not just medical studies. I think that's what confuses people as well. If you go back in the history of psychology, Stanley Milgram was doing studies, and there were other studies that were being done. The electric shock study, if you remember, if people were put in a situation where there was a subject and they were there to be a subject, but then the person who was the subject of the experiment, was told to sit in front of a machine where they thought they were giving this other person shocks. And there were no shocks, but the person who was being given the shocks was a stooge. They were part of the study. And it just escalated. And we found out that people are more than willing, when they're being told by an authority figure, you have to do this, you have to do this, it's for the cause of science. And they kept shocking the people to the point where they literally would have died if they had really been given shocks. That was done at a time when there was no IRB place. There were other studies where people were put in fake prison cells. Some were guards, some were prisoners. And we found out that in a very short time, people who were the prisoners end up really acting like prisoners and feeling like prisoners. And those who were guards, especially when they're given uniforms or something, they start to abuse their power. I mean, that was another study that really did have IRB approval. So it's not just in medicine. And I think that's what people have to be aware of, because they'll go into a study and say, oh, I'm just going to pull cases. I see these cases all the time. I have some for my teaching files. I'm just going to do a retrospective study. That requires IRB approval. You at least have to send it through the committee to get the waiver. You can't just think of IRB and HIPAA as, oh, it only applies when I'm looking at patients in healthcare. No, it extends to the whole broad spectrum, any kind of study that you want to do. When I do my studies, I study radiologists, and I have them come in, read images, and get their performance. A lot of people are doing this now with AI. Let's compare radiologists to AI. Using radiologists to interpret images, they're now human subjects. You have to get human subjects approval to be able to do that. So, it really is not just, oh, we're going to do something and inject this person with syphilis or whatever. We're not going to just give them this drug. There's a lot more to it. So people really have to be aware of anything that involves any sort of human being in a study is probably going to require IRB approval. And if it's a patient, you have to worry about it.
And that's interesting that you bring that up. Something I learned with the IRB too is that within the human subjects, there are also vulnerable populations. And for us in radiology, for example, our trainees and medical students are considered vulnerable because they are in the system. They depend on evaluations and ratings from the doctors. And so when they participate, they're vulnerable in that scenario. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. There's another law, FERPA. Since you brought up trainees, a lot of times you may want to say, let's go back and look at the data of people who are applying for residency, and let's do something with that. They are trainees, they're students. So there's another law called FERPA, which you may have to invoke to figure out, oh, can I actually do this? Because they are trainees. A lot of times people in radiology, since you brought it up, and with trainees, oh, we got a new MRI sequence. Hey, Susie, friend, why don't you just jump on the scanner and here, be a subject. So I'm a radiologist and I'm telling my resident to do that. No, that is not allowed. That's a form of implicit coercion.
Yeah, those things are very interesting. They happen all the time and people don't think about that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, exactly.
I want to maybe in the last few minutes talk a little bit about consent, because that can be very onerous when you have to get consent for a study, but it's also extremely important. Can you talk a little bit about the consent idea and what is part of that?
Yeah, consent is basically, it's a form, and every university has something similar, but the wording is ever so slightly different for every university. But they will typically have a template that you have to complete, and they have standard language in there. A consent form is basically allowing the subject to, one, know what the purpose of the study is. And so there's always a brief description of why are you here? It's a very brief description of what are you going to be doing? What are the expectations? And part and parcel, and you can go down another avenue, but if there's any subterfuge or if there's any reason that you're not telling the subjects exactly what it's about, the Human Subjects Committee must have approved all of that in advance. That's not just saying you're in the placebo or you're in the experimental group. That's usually there. But if there's some reason that you're not telling them everything, that has to be approved in advance. But it basically outlines what's the purpose of the study. It's going to say what's the benefit to you as an individual as well as the community. It will tell you about the risks that you're potentially going to encounter. And some of those risks can be as simple as the time it takes to do the study or boredom, but they could be as significant as you could die, depending on what the study's all about. It tells you about who to contact. So it tells you who the PI is. It will also give you information about the IRB committee, and it will give the contact information for that as well. And then it goes through basically your rights. Someone who's going to participate in the study, you have the right to withdraw at any time without penalty. You have the right to questions throughout. If there's payment involved, you may be, even if you withdraw, you have the right to ask for the payment or partial payment or something. Basically, it's a document that unfortunately a lot of people don't read, but all the information is there about the experiment, the risks, the benefits, what it's about, what your obligations are, what you're supposed to do, what the PI is supposed to do. Like I said, all your ways out of the study and so on. And then at the end, you're signing it, or a parent or guardian is signing it on behalf of their child. Or in some cases, a family relative is signing it on behalf of, say, someone who's in a coma or has been in an accident. And they're saying, okay, yes, you can be in a study and so on. But basically, it's the document that says, okay, I've read all this. I know what the study is about. I know the risks. I know the benefits. And yes, I am agreeing to be in it. And that has to be signed and dated by the person who's going to be in the study or their proxy and the investigator. And then
Great.
that becomes a legal document that must be retained typically for a period of at least 7 years is what most places have you do. And it is the documentation. Like I said, if somebody comes back and says, "Whoa, no, I didn't know what this was all about. Whoa, wow, I wasn't expecting that." The investigator come back and say, "No, it was all right here in the document that you signed."
Great. And in radiology, often when we do retrospective studies, we are able to argue that there's no more than minimal risk, and there could be a waiver of consent that the IRB may grant. Another thing that I learned that was difficult for me to grasp at first is that when you want to be exempt from the approval, you still have to put that application in for the IRB. So it was like, oh, wait, it's exempt, so I don't have to contact them. But no, so for exempt, you still have to let them know what you're doing, and they have to confirm that this is exempt. So for example, in my world, the quality improvement activities may fall in that category. And I think the only scenario where it's truly you don't need an IRB if when you meet the federal definitions of this not being human subjects research. So for example, when you use an open source public database or something like that, then you don't need it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
most places are going to have, there's a triage diagram. And most universities and healthcare systems are going to have it where you go through and it's, okay, are human subjects involved? Okay. Yes, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And then you go down. Okay. And then it goes down different trees and different branches. And you can end up at, okay, yes, this is human subjects. No, it's not. But like I said, the one that most people don't recognize or don't realize is human subjects is a retrospective. And they'll say, but I'm de-identifying. Okay, that's nice. That's required. But that doesn't make it not human subjects. Yeah, I just had an email from somebody the other day who was asking me, okay, I want to do an educational exhibit at RSNA. And I want to use 5 de-identified images. Do I need IRB? The answer is no. So like you said, there are circumstances where you can utilize patient information and you don't have to worry about, as long as you de-identify them and so on, you don't have to worry about HIPAA, you don't have to worry about IRB. 1, because it is just a minimal set of images. 2, it's an educational exhibit. It wasn't research. So there are circumstances, but you just got to be aware of it. And this person did reach out to your vice chair of research or reach out to your IRB office and just simply ask them, because they're more than willing to sit there and tell you yes or no. A lot of people, oh my God, they're all there just to prevent research from happening. No, they are there to protect you. They are there to protect the people in your studies. They are there to protect you. They are there to protect the institution that you're working in. It's not a matter of putting up roadblocks. It's a matter of looking out for what's best for all those people. And that's why we need them and why they're such an important part of the research process.
On that note, I think we can end the discussion. That's really great how you said that. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your time. I learned a lot actually during our discussion today. It was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.